Here are my 5 favorite ways to target the hip abductors in yoga. The hip abductors are these muscles that live here on the side of our hips, and they're also sometimes called the lateral hips. And when they work, what they do is they do abduction of the hip. And hip abduction is when the thigh moves away from midline. And the kind of complementary movement to that is hip adduction, where the thigh crosses midline. So if we want to target the hip abductors, we want to work hip abduction against resistance. And then just a point about hip abduction is we often learn about it in a demonstration like this is hip abduction, the leg going out to the side. And while it is, we just want to point out that that's hip abduction in an open chain manner. Open chain meaning that the distal end of my limb or my foot is free to move. So my hip abductors, they move the leg into abduction, open chain, and it looks like that. But there's also closed chain hip abduction. And that version of hip abduction is actually what we more commonly do, like in day-to-day life and even on the yoga mat. So just for our movement eyes to see, and this can be a little tricky, I know, but closed chain hip abduction would be the same action. The muscles are working in the same way, but instead of the foot moving, the foot stays fixed and then the rest of the body moves relative to that. That's closed chain hip abduction. So one way that's kind of helpful for visualizing this is pretend I was standing here, but then I shifted my hips off to the side and I was kind of standing like this. Maybe your movement eyes can see that at this hip joint, my thigh right now is an adduction. It's crossed the midline because my hips are off to the side, so my thigh is angling inward. So if I wanted to like stand up straight or whatever, bring my hips in, I would use my hip abductors to abduct the thigh, to move it through abduction to get back to neutral. So like when we're standing upright and when we're not leaning into a hip, we are using our hip abductors a little bit just to hold us there. But then if we were to stand on one leg, then we load the hip abductors of the standing leg even more because like this might want to happen and then we're pulling in here. So with that said, yoga's single leg balance poses like tree pose and big toe pose and just all of the single leg standing are great ways to load the hip abductors and to work them, especially in that closed chain manner. So those are already built into the yoga practice and we do those and those are great. But for today, I wanted to point out 5 other ways to target the hip abductors that you may or may not have thought of before and might be some good ideas for intentionally bringing into your yoga practice. Here's my first favorite way to target the hip abductors in yoga. And this might be the most unique and different one of all of these movements that I'll show today. But I really like it. And what it involves is we lie down on our side. So we come down to lie on our side, take our arms straight forward and stack our hands. And then we'll take our top leg straight out in front of us. So we're lying on our side, top leg straight out in front. Hands are stacked. And then what's going to happen? Well, I want to target the hip abductors of this leg that's reaching straight across. So in order to do that, I can it's not simply because this is tough, but it's kind of simply in terms of the movement. I simply lift my foot up off the floor and then lower my foot down. So in lifting and lowering, I'm using my lateral hip muscles to do that of this top hip. Technically, to be a little anatomy geeky about it, this is technically horizontal hip abduction and not just frontal plane hip abduction, but it's still working our hip abductors. So this is a great and just kind of sneaky one because, you know, we're lying down. We're like on the floor, pretty much lying down. So it could be quite a surprise to think we could come down into this position and then we can actually really work our hips. It's pretty strong. So after doing some of those, it's also convenient because from this position, we could pretty easily then just open up into like a reclined twist and just relax here for a little bit to kind of counter that work of the hip lift. But that is my first example of a kind of different and creative way we can target the hip abductors. My second favorite way to target the hip abductors in yoga is with quadruped lateral leg lifts. And in this position, we will start in quadruped hands and knees, and then we'll step a leg out to the side. So I just want to show you this base position from the front, just so you see it from this angle, because now I'm going to turn to the side and we'll bring a block in here. The block is not necessary, but it's very helpful for getting like the most out of the movement. So anyway, we come into that position where we're on hands and knees and our leg is out to the side, and then block or no block, but I like the block. We simply lift our foot up and over the block, and then we set it down behind, and then lift up and set down in front. And so as we're doing this, we are working those lateral hip muscles, the hip abductors, to lift, and then we set it down, and then we lift and set the foot down. And all the while we're doing our best to keep the whole rest of our body still. We are not, as we do this, we're not like leaning over to the side to do this, but we're trying to hold everything just tall and still as we move that foot. And that's the quadruped lateral leg lifts. My third favorite way to target the hip abductors in yoga is using forearm side plank. So here's forearm side plank. We are here, and just holding this position is already targeting my hip abductors on the bottom hip. So this is already a good one. But if we wanted to make it more dynamic, we could do hip dips where we lower and we lift. And when we lower, we're going to put a stretch on the lateral hips. And then as we lift, we contract and shorten them back in. So this actually moves the bottom lateral hip through a fuller range of motion. And we know that moving through a full range of motion can be extra potent for creating strength. So hip dips is one forearm side plank thing. And then the other thing we can do is stay up in forearm side plank and then lift and lower the top leg. And this is tricky because now we're working hip abduction dynamically on the top leg, while we're also working hip abduction isometrically on the bottom leg. And all of that is a great challenge for the hip abductors. My fourth favorite way to target the hip abductors in yoga kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about yoga's single leg balance poses, like tree and like so many others. All of these are really good ways to target the hip abductor on the standing leg, because this one is working to keep the hip hugged in and keep us standing up tall as we balance. So standing single leg balances are good for the hip abductors, but if we wanted to just kind of step it up a little or accentuate that a little, we could stand on a yoga block with one foot on, one foot off. And then we do what we call a pelvic drop, where we lower the standing leg foot toward the floor, and then we lift it up, maybe even higher than it started. And then we lower and we lift. And this movement that's happening might seem kind of subtle, but where it's actually originating is in my standing leg hip abductors. They lengthen and contract as I lower this floating leg, and then they shorten and contract as I lift back up. So it's a nice way to load the hip abductors through a full range of motion. And if you stand and repeat that several times, you should really start to feel that work in your lateral hips. My fifth favorite way to target the hip abductors in yoga is in a variation of plank pose that we might call plank with abduction. So this will definitely work the hip abductors, but it also works a lot more as well. It's not like so single focused as like the pelvic drops that I just showed, but it's a great one to kind of move the hip really through a full range of motion. So we start in plank pose, and then we lift a foot off the floor and we take it wide and as far forward as we can, and then we set the heel down. And then without moving anything else, we lift the leg, sweep it back, and place the foot back down. So, and you know, depending on your range of motion and control, we may or may not, we will step that foot forward to different degrees, but you just step it forward as far, well, my voice gets a little shaky, as you're able to. And then with control, we step it back. So that's plank with hip abduction. That wraps up my 5 favorite ways to target the hip abductors in yoga. I hope you appreciated these suggestions and the little anatomy education that went along with them. And if you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel so that you can stay up to date on all of the tips that I share.